33. But Warren had already returned with the salt, and he and Tom, with Annabel between them, were setting out for the woodland pasture where Father kept the sheep. Caddie hastened to catch up with them, and Hetty, still wondering, tagged along behind them. "Will they eat out of my hand if I hold it for them?" asked Annabel, taking the chunk of salt from Warren. "Sure," said Tom. "They're crazy about salt." "But you mustn't hold it," said Hetty, coming up panting. "You must lay it down where the sheep can get it." "Now, Hetty," said Caddie, "what did I tell you about keeping perfectly quiet?" "You do just as you like, Annabel," said Tom kindly. "Well, of course," said Annabel, "I shall prefer to hold it and let the cunning little lamb eat it right out of my hand." "All right," said Tom, "you go in alone then, and we'll stay outside the fence where we can watch you." "It's so nice of you to let me do it," said Cousin Annabel. "How do you call them?" Tom uttered a low, persuasive call, the call to salt. He uttered it 2 or 3 times, and sheep began coming from all parts of the woods into the open pasture. Annabel stood there expectantly, holding out the salt, a bright smile on her face. "We don't have sheep in Boston," she said, but almost immediately the smile began to fade. The sheep were crowding all around here, so close that she could hardly move. They were treading on her toes and climbing on each other's back to get near her. Frightened, she held the salt out of their reach, and then they began to try to climb on her as if she had been a ladder. There was a perfect pandemonium of bleating and baaing, and above their noses rose Annabel's despairing shriek. "Drop the salt and run," called Tom, himself a little frightened at the success of his joke. But running was not as easy a matter as 30 or 40 sheep around her, all still believing that she held the salt. At last poor Annabel succeeded in breaking away, and they helped her over the fence. But when she was safe on the other side, everybody stopped and looked at her in amazement. The 80 sparkling jet buttons had disappeared from her beautiful frock. The sheep had eaten them. "Oh, my buttons!" cried Annabel. There were 80 of them, 6 more than Bessie Beasley had. "And where is my sun hat?" Across the fence, in the milling crowd of sheep, the wicked Woodlawns beheld the glee of Annabel's beautiful sun hat, rakishly dangling from the left horn of an old ring. Father speaks. If Annabel had rushed home crying and told Mother, the Woodlawn children would have been greatly surprised. But there seemed to be more to Annabel than met the eye. "What a quaint experience," she said. "They'll hardly believe it when I tell them about it in Boston." Her voice was a trifle shaky, but just as polite as ever, and she went right upstairs without speaking to Clara or Mother, and changed into another dress. That evening she was more quiet than she had been the night before, and she had almost nothing to say about the superiority of her native city over the rest of the uncivilized world. Caddie noticed with remorse that Annabel walked a little stiffly, and she surmised that the ground had not been very soft at the place where Pete had scraped her off. "I wish I hadn't promised Tom to play that next trick on her," Caddie thought to herself. "Maybe he'll let me off." But Tom said no, it was a good trick, and Annabel had asked for it, and Caddie had promised to do her part, and she had better go through with it. "All right," said Caddie. After all, it was a good trick, and Annabel had asked for it. "Let's see," said Tom the next day. "You wanted to turn somersaults in the haymow, didn't you, Cousin Annabel?" "Well, I suppose that's one of the things always does on the farm, isn't it?" And Cousin Annabel, a trifle less eagerly than she had welcomed their suggestions of the day before. The beautiful 8 buttons dress had not appeared today. Annabel had a loose blouse over a neat full skirt. "Of course I never turn somersaults in Boston. You understand, it's so quaint and rustic." Page 237.